Good afternoon. My name is Pradeep Kakatil. I serve as the Director for Innovations at UNAIDS. Thank you for joining us on this very interesting panel on Treat All. We are trying to treat the world and try and see what are the lessons across diseases that we can learn and how can we learn from the HIV experience and from other experiences and try and look at scaling up treatment. I started working on HIV in Chennai in South India in 1991. We set up some of the early prevention programs addressing female sex workers and their clients, men having sex with men, and transgendered community. In the early days, treatment was unimaginable for many of us. It was not an option, costing way too much. It was anywhere between 60 to 90,000, and I knew one movie star back home who came to London every other month to get his treatment. Even in 1996, it was still unaffordable, even when it was $10,000 to $15,000. Until 2001, treatment for many of us was just a dream. We have seen that activism by many of us in this room and many others who are not here in this room with us today. It has changed. It was researchers, it was activists, community members, it was businesses. Many of us standing up, basically fighting bureaucracy, looking at political engagement, bringing the private sector and also challenging them, demanding changes in regulatory processes. We changed all that. We have seen rapid progress in treatment. Even just 2005, we had 1.3 million people on treatment. And then we had this dream of having 15 million on treatment by 2015, the 15 by 15 that many of us fought for. But even that we reached 9 months ahead of schedule in late 2014, we reached that. We have 22 million people on antiretroviral treatment today, but it hasn't been an easy journey. I don't know how many of us were around when we were discussing 3 by 5 and negotiating even something as late as end of 2010 around the 15 by 15 targets. There were so many naysayers. People said that we don't have the systems, we don't have the capacities, we don't have resources. And of course the threat was that drug resistance is going to really make most of our drugs irrelevant if we start scaling up treatment without really putting in systems in place. But I think what the AIDS movement has demonstrated is that nothing can stop us. Political engagement, community activism, and innovation really helped us to get where we are. We still have a long way, don't get me wrong, we still have a long way to go, miles to go, as the UNAIDS report says. Our gains are way too fragile. Political ownership and the political climate today is a huge challenge. We have challenges around ownership in many parts of the world. Stigma still kills more people than anything else. Financial investments that are needed to sustain the gains, but also to scale up. We are still short of 6 billion every year when it comes to financing the scale up. So we still have a long way to go. We still need resources to reach the 14 million people who need treatment. So we have a long way to go. We also need simpler, more durable, long-acting antiretrovirals. There are also disparities across regions. If you look at West and Central Africa, 1 out of 3 people have access to treatment, and that's just not acceptable. So I'm not trying to say that HIV has all the lessons. So I just want to make sure that we are balanced in this conversation. There are issues around transition financing, and how can we make sure that we have a fully funded global fund replenishment next year, and also a fully funded AIDS response. But there's also the need for us to change. We need to start looking at, as this conference says, building bridges, but also breaking a lot of bubbles that we have built around ourselves, and we need to see how best we can do that. TB, again, I believe that the virus and the bacteria have partnered very well, but we haven't really done enough when it comes to HIV and TB co-infection. There's huge opportunity. Or if you look at hepatitis, or if you start looking at HPV, or I could go on with the list. You could go to diabetes or even hypertension. There are so many other areas where we need to do a lot more. I think while we have been successful in building the AIDS movement, I just wonder whether we have done it at a cost that we have gone way too far too alone. Maybe we have isolated ourselves in some areas. How can we learn from the AIDS movement, and how can we look at lessons from other disease responses to really provide long-term, affordable, quality health for everyone? So it is my pleasure to invite Andrew Hill as the first panelist. Andrew is a senior research fellow at the University of Liverpool in the UK, and he specializes in access to medicines. He's consulted for WHO and the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Andrew will provide a brief overview on commonalities across treatment and diseases. Andrew.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So just to start off with, just to remind ourselves, every year all over the world, millions of people die from lack of access to simple medicines. And there are many reasons why they can't access the medicines, but one of the key reasons is because of high drug prices. And there are many cases of drugs being very, very cheap to make and being sold for 100 times, 1,000 times cost of production. And some of these drugs are even generics. This is true not just for HIV, across a whole range of different diseases. Almost all medicines are very cheap to manufacture. We've worked with the World Health Organization on costing all the medicines in the Essential Medicines drug list, and we have lists of those. There's a website here if you'd like more details. So what we do is we look at the raw ingredients being manufactured in India or China, and there are databases showing how much it costs to make a kilogram of almost any drug you like. Imatinib for cancer or sofosbuvir for hepatitis C. And from those raw material costs, you can work out how much it really costs to make a medicine. I'll give you one example. This is pomalidomide, a drug from an American company called Celgene to treat multiple myeloma. Now it's sold in the United Kingdom for almost £116,000 per year, and it costs £100 to make. We have so many examples. I could present for hours going through all the different medicines like this. So a course of treatment for hepatitis C sold in the United States for up to $84,000. It can be made for $47. A course of treatment, imatinib for leukemia, sold in the United States for $106,000, can be made for $180. I'll just give you an example for HIV. So this is dolutegravir, which you might have heard of at this conference. $1,800 for 1 kilogram of dolutegravir. Now, that means that to treat one person for a year, the amount of actual raw material would cost $33. If you then add in the costs of formulating the drug, packaging, and a profit margin to generic suppliers, you're talking about a base price for dolutegravir of $42 per person per year. That same drug is sold in the United States for just over $20,000 as the list price. And then a company might say, well, we have this system of fair pricing where we have higher prices in high-income countries and lower prices in low-income countries, which sounds reasonable. Have a look at this analysis here. So this is, on the y-axis, you've got the gross domestic product per person per year. So an idea of the income of the country. And on the x-axis, on the y-axis, you've got the price of dolutegravir. On the x-axis, you've got GDP. No correlation between the income of a country and how much they're being charged. So in Bulgaria, they're paying almost $10,000 a year for dolutegravir, and Brazil, which has a GDP just slightly higher, is being charged $365. So this argument is not working. There are many inequalities in drug pricing, and countries don't get the price they deserve, they get the price they negotiate. We should have widespread access to generic drugs. When patents have expired, drugs should be available worldwide at close to their costs of production. However, when I give this talk in different countries, very few health authorities actually know where they should be starting their negotiation from. They don't know how much the drugs cost to make. And if you get a low cost for a generic drug, if any new drug comes along, it drives down the price of those, and you can get a price cascade across the therapeutic area. So if you have a low price for tenofovir, then the tenofovir alafenamide price has to come down. If you get a low price for efavirenz, the dolutegravir price has to come down. And I think most health and finance ministers in most countries, if you actually did the maths for them and showed them how much they could save from their budgets, they would just be amazed, and how many more people they could treat, whether they could actually have campaigns to systematically treat cancers and tuberculosis and hepatitis, diabetes. What should happen when a patent expires is that the drug cost should fall dramatically. It's called the patent cliff. And there are examples of many very basic drugs being sold all over the world at very low prices. The most basic drugs like paracetamol, statins, warfarin, etc. And actually, now that tenofovir, 3TC, efavirenz are off patent in almost every country worldwide, there's no reason why any country shouldn't get access to tenofovir, 3TC, efavirenz for a price close to $90 per year. This is a generic. It should be available at a generic price everywhere. It's not happening yet. We do have minimum prices in a number of countries, and we've coined this term 90-90-90. Nobody should pay more than $90 for a year's treatment for HIV, to cure hepatitis C, to treat hepatitis B, or to treat tuberculosis. But you can see on the left-hand column here how much the United States pays compared to the estimated costs and the global lowest prices. We've got crazy prices for drugs, not just in the United States, in a whole range of different high-income and high-middle-income countries. What can also happen, that you don't get the patent cliff, you'll get companies actually then raising the price in the long term. We investigated a South African generic company called Aspen that were taking simple cancer drugs, raising the price massively and actually threatening governments with cutting off their supplies unless they agreed to 1,000% increases in drug prices. They've since been sued, and there are other, it's not just Martin Shkreli and Daraprim, there are many other companies trying to do the same thing. We looked at prices of treatments for opportunistic infections in South Africa, and the South Africans in some cases seem to be paying over 10 times more than the Indians to treat cryptococcal meningitis, CMV retinitis, disseminated MAI, or MDR-TB. What can also happen is after a patent expires, the drug price never comes down. And a good example of that is one of the oldest drugs that we know of. So insulin was discovered in 1923. A vial of insulin costs $1 to make. There are forms of insulin now which should be close to $1 sold for up to $240 per vial. Now, you could discount everything I've said so far. You could say, well, it's very interesting talking about cost of production in poor countries, but drug companies need to make money. They need to make money to pay for research and development, and those research and development costs are very high. If anybody comes up with that argument and you're faced with a pricing decision, just ask two questions to the pharmaceutical company. How much money have you made from your therapeutic areas so far? And how much have you spent on research and development? And I imagine that the actual percentage of profit spent on R&D in most companies will be very small, and most drug companies spend more on advertising their products and marketing their products than they do on actually researching new ones. If you look just at HIV in the last 15 years, the sales of the HIV drugs are over $200 billion US. This is just up to the end of 2016, and then an extra $20 to $25 billion per year. So these profits, these sales are vast, and they vastly outweigh the costs of research and development. If you look just at one company, Gilead, so far have sold $55 billion in sales of hepatitis C drugs, and profits in a single year of $18 billion. So the actual costs of research and development have long since been repaid, and now we're just talking about a situation where the profit keeps climbing and the epidemic of hepatitis C is going nowhere. We're not actually on course to eradicate it at all. And finally, when companies talk about then the vast amounts of money that they're spending on research and development, tax avoidance. Some of these companies will have accounts in Bermuda, in the Cayman Islands, in the Bahamas, Luxembourg, avoiding billions of dollars in taxes. If you just took this, This amount of money, say Pfizer, $20 billion avoided in taxes, Merck, $16 billion, Johnson & Johnson, $14 billion. This is enough money to treat whole epidemics. You could eradicate hepatitis C. You could treat everybody for HIV just with the tax avoidance. So don't fall into this trap that pharma companies will sell you, trying to say that they've got fair pricing across countries, the prices are affordable, and that they're spending a reasonable amount, and that their profits are justifiable. So just to finish off, if you are in a position where you can influence prices at the country level, what I'd recommend doing is show countries how much they could save from buying all generic drugs at close to cost prices. I think most ministries of health would be amazed at how cheaply these drugs can be made. Maximize the use of generics in national treatment campaigns, identify high quality generic suppliers, there are many of them and they produce very good drugs. Reevaluate the cost effectiveness of all patented drugs. Once the prices of the generics go down, the prices of the patented drugs should also fall. And if companies refuse to lower prices, which often they do, and Alan's going to talk about this later, there are many legal mechanisms that you can get involved with. You can use TRIPS flexibilities, you can issue compulsory licenses. We have many buyers clubs. We have thousands of people in the UK importing generics for their personal use, not just for HIV, for cancer, for hepatitis, for other diseases. And you can challenge the patent. So I think there's a huge agenda to take all the learnings we have from HIV and apply them across a whole range of different diseases. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much, Andrew. That was fascinating. I'm just going to put Anil on the spot. Anil is the head of global infectious diseases at Mylan, and he works across the company to accelerate the pace at which new HIV, TB, hepatitis, and other treatments reach those in need. Anil, that was a fascinating presentation by Andrew, and one of the issues that I would like you to address is how can we really follow some of the... Andrew has put out a challenge. I mean, the pharma companies are really hiking up the prices. There is a need for countries also to look at how we can get generics at a different price. Just want you to respond and then also talk about, historically look back at access to generics in the AIDS movement and what's helped us to get 22 million people on treatment.
Sure. Well, thanks, Pradeep, and thanks, Andrew. Let me answer the first question last, and let me start with what's worked in generics globally and in HIV. I'll talk about three things, actually. What's worked with generics and HIV, the success we've had to date. Secondly, the unfinished business of generics and HIV. And Pradeep, you mentioned this. We have an unfinished business and an agenda for HIV. And then reflections from at least this generic company I represent, Mylan, which is the world's largest manufacturer of antiretrovirals, on other diseases and what the challenges are there. And the spoiler alert is that I don't think it's just about price. So first, just a 101 on generics. Essentially, the way that generic companies work, and it's side-by-side companies like the innovators or the larger pharmaceutical companies, is that in the higher income markets in the United States and Europe, what has traditionally been true over the last few decades is that a company develops a new product and does invest R&D. You can debate how much money goes into the R&D. And in part, as a way to incentivize that R&D, you then have a period of time where there's one company who's making and selling a product. And after that period of exclusivity, there's multiple manufacturers, generic companies, who make the product and the prices go down, in part because of competition and in part because we don't have the same cost structure because we didn't do the R&D. So that's the way generics generally work in the United States and Europe. And what you see, at least in the United States, which is where I'm from, is that 90% of prescriptions are actually generic medicines. Now, that's only 20% of the value of the market because these are fundamentally different price points, but 90% of the prescriptions that Americans take are generic medicines. One point that I would make, because this is a community of activists and advocates and people who push policy forward, is that the scheme of generic medicines has worked for oral solid dose medicines in particular, but not necessarily, as Andrew pointed out, insulin, biologic products, or devices. And so I actually think there's a good set of products where patents are not a restriction, and yet you don't see the low-cost alternative, and that's something that Mylan and other companies are are working on, for example, with biosimilars. So that's Generics 101. What's worked on HIV? Well, many of you have been part of this fight against HIV for decades, so you know this very well. But 20 years ago, when we looked at the possibility of treatment in developing countries, the cost was going to be $10,000. Of course, that wasn't possible. Then generic companies led the way. Yusuf Hamid from Cipla deserves enormous credit because he got up and said, we can do it for $1 a day, and we can combine medicines in developing countries that are not in a single pill in the United States or Europe. And that was really what allowed a healthy industry to now exist. There's 21.7 million people on treatment. Most of that, 20 million or more, is in developing countries. That's extraordinary. A lot of people didn't think that was possible 20 years ago. I'm sure the people in this room knew that it was possible. And all of those people are essentially on one combination of medicine, which Andrew mentioned, tenofovir, lamivudine, efavirenz. That's going to change thanks to dolutegravir and ViiV, but that's available for less than $100 per year versus $10,000, which is what we were talking about 20 years ago. 20 million people, that's an enormous amount of capacity, 10 times the number that are on treatment in the US and Europe. And you have multiple generic manufacturers who are making these products. So that is successful, and hopefully we can expand that to other disease states. TLD, just to say something about that, Mylan and Aurobindo are the two first manufacturers, approved manufacturers of TLD, the combination with dolutegravir or Tivicay, which ViiV developed. And thanks to a volume guarantee with the Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Gates Foundation, rather than launch the product at a high price and then see prices go down, it's been launched at $6 per month in developing countries, or $72 per year. So that's an extraordinary step forward, again, because now even with generics, you don't have that time lag of the cost coming down. We have found ways to launch at this low cost. One point that I would make is that the time to market can still be condensed. So ViiV, which developed Tivicay, dolutegravir, they brought that product to market in the US and Europe in 2013. And we're here in 2018 talking about TLD for all. But that's a 5-year gap. And I think that we should all aspire to that gap being 4, 3, 2, 1, and ultimately 0 years. There shouldn't be a reason why Africans or Asians or Latin Americans can't have access to a medicine in the same year that Americans and Europeans have access. And so I think there's more room to grow and to improve. But we live in a world today in which you have the ViiVs or Gileads or Janssen's of the world developing new therapeutic agents, and then you have the Mylans or Aurobindos or Ciplas of the world being able to offer those products quickly in developing countries, and we have the scale and we have the cost structure that they don't, and I think they would readily say this, so that we can do it at a fundamentally different price and a fundamentally different scale. Second topic, what's the unfinished business on HIV? There's a few things, because I think before we talk about how do we replicate the generic success of HIV into other disease states, let's just be clear, we're not done on HIV in terms of generic access. First of all, on global prevention, we're not nearly where we need to be. As I think all of you know, treatment is prevention. We need to get people on treatment much, much more quickly. PrEP, there's not nearly enough people accessing PrEP, and whether that's because of stigma or ways we can improve the product, make it more friendly for the people who want to use PrEP, that's something that should be on us and others. Middle-income countries, I'm sure Sharon Ann's going to speak about this, but oh my God, we are in a really risky position on middle-income countries. As they transition away from donor support, including the Global Fund, you have countries that are going to go from a system of centralized procurement, waived registration, high-quality standards, low cost, to the opposite of all of that. And so now you actually have slow registration in those countries because they don't have the waivers thanks to the donor or centralized procurement mechanisms. You have quality go down and prices can go up or down. And so I think middle-income countries need to be an incredibly important agenda item for all of us in terms of the unfinished business on HIV. And lastly, the unfinished business on HIV is that in some settings, and this is an international AIDS conference, including the United States and Europe, you don't have generic access, actually. So even though generics are dominating ARV access in developing countries, in the United States, there's $20 billion spent on HIV treatment, $20 billion, that's a tripling in the last 10 years, which is much higher than any other drug category, and generic access is 1/10 what it is in HIV than other disease categories. So there's unfinished business in the high-income markets. Other diseases. So the way I would state this, and actually this is not about generics and price, at least as a hypothesis, there are certain ingredients in HIV that have allowed for wide-scale access. One is donor money. The second is centralized procurement. The third is high levels of quality, which is associated with the use of donor money, so a stringent regulatory approval or WHO pre-qualification. The fourth is a really robust normative process where there's a pipeline of new products and also a WHO or other organizations saying, here are the combinations that we want from the marketplace, whether it be the innovators or generic companies. And fifth is a really robust civil society that can help drive demand and actually move from one product to another. The reason why we're going to see the shift to TLD is because of that community in HIV. And whether you look at TB or hepatitis or non-communicable diseases, we don't have that same set of 5 criteria. So those 5 ingredients we don't have. In tuberculosis, we don't have that pipeline, unfortunately. There have been very few new TB therapeutics approved, and we don't have that same normative coherence. Mylan is looking into TB products. We have the ability to supply Delamidin under an agreement with Otsuka, but understanding what the demand actually is, how much volume we need to make, whether the purchasing is going to be of Bedaquiline or Delamidin is less clear in the tuberculosis space, and the demand creation isn't as strong, I would say, as in TB as in HIV. In hepatitis, and Charles is here and can speak to this better than I can, we don't have donor money and we don't have consistent quality standards. So you have lots of manufacturers making very low-price DAAs consistent with Andrew's goals of a low-price cure for hepatitis, but you don't actually have volumes taking up. And again, it's because we don't have that set of conditions in place as we've seen in HIV. And in non-communicable diseases, and I should just state that here because once we treat the infectious diseases, there's a lot of other conditions we're going to need to tackle in these settings. We don't have any of those ingredients in place. And as a consequence, you don't see the same type of low-cost, wide-scale access of generic products in these settings. So I hope that's helpful food for thought. Did I answer the questions that you wanted me to, Pradeep?
We'll come back to it.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
Thank you, Anil. I'm sure that there will be a number of questions, and I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity towards the end to have a lively exchange. Let me move to Ellen Cohen, who's going to talk to us about TRIPS Flexibilities 2.0 across diseases, and how can we stay ahead of the curve and think of the future. Ellen has a PhD, is a lawyer, is a public health advocate, and she's written a number of books. I have a long CV which really speaks to her work. Over to you, Ellen.
Oh dear. What do I do now? That one. I don't know, they all have the same title. It looks like mine. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to start by thanking UNAIDS for inviting me to take part in this amazing gathering. I also need to say that zero tolerance for sexual violence requires 100% effort, particularly by UNAIDS. We cannot be told that there are more important things to do than that. That is the kind of leadership that we expect from an organization like UNAIDS, and we don't see that 100% commitment at the moment. This needs to change for the sake of the organization, the wonderful people that work for it, and for the sake of the fight against HIV and AIDS. With that, I will now talk a little bit about the sixth ingredient, which Anil did not mention, and that is the use of TRIPS flexibility and flexibility in the approach towards patent law in general. Now, can I safely assume everyone knows what TRIPS is? It stands for the Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, which is the Treaty of the World Trade Organization, came into being in 1995, which sets the global norms for the protection of intellectual property, including patents. Now, patent is a right given to an innovator to exclude others from using his or her innovation for a certain period of time. But the TRIPS agreement also allows for flexibility in that, because of course if you give that kind of monopoly, you need safeguards, because otherwise you might hamper WTO members, these are governments, right to protect public health, and in particular to promote access to medicines for all. That flexibility is built into the TRIPS agreement. It's constantly under threat, but I'm going to tell you the positive side of the story because it has been absolutely key in the last 15 or so years. I want to zoom in on 2 TRIPS flexibilities in particular that have been used rather widely, particularly for the procurement of affordable generic HIV medicines. Now, one is the public non-commercial use. You are probably familiar with the term compulsory licensing. This is a particular form of compulsory licensing where the government, in a way, gives the compulsory license to itself. So it makes use of the patent without the consent of the patent holder. It will have to pay remuneration, a royalty to the patent holder. There are no prior negotiations required, which makes it a very good tool to use in day-to-day procurement. It does not, I repeat, it does not require an emergency situation, neither does regular compulsory licensing, and therefore, as I said, it can be part of routine procurement. This is how it works, because it is different for different countries. For example, there's a grouping of least developed country members of the WTO that do not have to grant or enforce pharmaceutical product patents, even if they are already in existence. This is a decision chart that is available, downloadable from our website, and I'll show you where that is later. But first question, are you a least developed country? Yes. You can make use of the least developed country provisions and you buy generic from a quality source. You are not a least developed country. Is the medicine patented? Always an important question to ask. You go to the MATSPAL database, for example, that is held by the Medicines Patent Pool, and figure it out. It's not patented, no problem. You buy from a quality generic source. The medicine is patented. Is there a patent license agreement? And is your country part of the territory? The Medicines Patent Pool holds all the licenses for HIV, or most of the licenses for HIV medicines, and a number for hepatitis C medicines. Your country is part of the regulatory. You buy generic from the licensee, which will always be a quality source because WHO pre-qualification is a requirement. You are not part of the licensed territory. Does the license agreement, for example, the one held by the Medicines Patent Pool, allow the generic licensee to supply a country that has used the TRIPS flexibility? You will find that that is almost always the case. In that case, you make use of that. You issue a government use license. You buy from a generic source. That is not possible. For example, it's a bilateral license from a originator with a generic company. Are there other sources of generic product? Yes, you make government use and you buy from a generic pre-qualified source. There are not other generic sources. Then things become a little bit more tricky, and since I only have 10 minutes, I can't explain to you how that would work, but there is, even for that situation, a flexibility that has led to the only ever amendment to a WTO rule, the TRIPS Article 31 bis. Again, different presentation. So that's how it can work. It isn't always applied like that, but that is how the system is actually designed. Now, has this been used? How many of you have heard people say, oh, these TRIPS flexibilities, they've never been used, or they don't work? No one's heard that? You're a bunch of liars. Well, you are right, because it has been used rather widely, and particularly in the earlier days, shortly after the Global Fund started to disperse its monies, because Anil's quite right, the financing has been absolutely key in that. But the suppliers, the traditional suppliers, such as UNICEF and IDA, but also NGOs, were rather hesitant to ship these generic medicines that at that time could be made, because of no patents in countries such as India, to countries where these products were patented. Patents on HIV medicines were abundant, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Those countries have made use of these TRIPS flexibilities, both the LDC provision and the government use provision, on a very large scale for the use, for the importation in particular, in some cases also production of HIV medication. Now, that is the first peak. The second peak you see here, that is quite interesting, because here in this period, the medicine's patent pool already was quite functional for HIV, but the later uses of the TRIPS flexibility, particularly the compulsory licenses, have been for non-communicable diseases, and most of those for cancer medicines. And I think that tells us something about the challenges for the future. So TRIPS flexibilities only applied for HIV until today, predominantly for HIV, but also for other diseases. Thailand, for example, has quite successfully used them for cardiovascular medication and for cancer medication in 2007 and 2008. And last year, Malaysia has issued a government use license for sofosbuvir because they could not obtain a price from the originator company Gilead that would allow them to implement a universal access scheme, which they wanted to do. This has led them to bring the price down to around $300 for a 12-week treatment. Now, what's interesting is that these TRIPS flexibilities are starting to make headlines in high-income countries, which is further evidence to the fact that the high drug pricing crisis is now a truly global one. When I started to work on access to medicines about 20 years ago, that was predominantly an issue of developing countries, but today you see the rationing of proven effective medicines even in high-income countries, and here are just a few examples of what is happening almost as we speak in a variety of European countries, but also recently in the United States, where the state of Louisiana threatened with issuing a compulsory license for sofosbuvir, which has actually I believe, brought the negotiations with Gilead on a different plane. You don't always actually have to follow through. You don't always actually have to issue the compulsory license. I've seen in many cases there where a country is serious to do it, and it is actually a credible threat, it really helps in the negotiations. Companies will come forward and, for example, offer a voluntary license, or perhaps change their mind with regard to whether they will want to work with the patent pool or not, or lower their price to a level that the government says, yes, that is a price that we can afford in our healthcare system. Now, I need to absolutely stress that there is no use for these patent-related measures, such as compulsory license or government use, if there is no patent, or if there is no patent anymore, for example, after a successful patent opposition or patent expiry, naturally. If the patent does not have to be enforced, such as the case in least developed countries, they do not have to do that until at least 2033. When the price is affordable, this does not come into play, and when the patent holder is willing to license on public health terms, such as to the medicine's patent pool. Now, as I said, we're looking at a drug price crisis. When Anil talked about the price of 10,000 for antiretrovirals and what an enormous barrier that is, if now a new drug goes to market for 10,000, we say, wow, that's a real bargain. That's how we sort of, we're getting used to these enormous figures. 100,000, well, the winner at this moment is Luxturna, which is a drug for the treatment of a hereditary blindness disease, is 850,000. And when that price was announced, commentators said, whew, it's not as bad as we thought, because we thought it was going to be $1 million. So this is not sustainable. Something needs to be done. And when we start thinking about what needs to be done, we need to realize why these medicines can be priced like this. And it has to do with the fact that these high prices have their roots in financing models of pharmaceutical research and development that are based on the granting of market exclusivities through patents or otherwise. I mean, sometimes you could even see that patents are the least of our worries, because there you have remedies, you have flexibilities, but there are other forms of flexibility, such as those granted through the regulatory system, data exclusivity, for example, or market exclusivity, for which no remedies exist. In Europe, for example, if a country, even in the greatest health emergency you can imagine, needs to resort to a government use license, it can actually not register the drug under European medicines law. This is a huge discrepancy, a huge lack of coherence, legislative coherence that needs to be fixed, of course. Now, this is a situation where we cannot compulsory license ourselves out of. This needs a much more fundamental approach, and what we need to start working on is new models of research and development financing that de-link paying for the cost of research and development from the price. And as Andrew said, greater transparency about what that cost actually is would really help to inform this policy debate. On this website listed here, the linkage.org, you can read about some of the ideas behind this. But two ministers said it much more beautifully than I ever can at the launch of the Lancet report on essential medicines policies, where they actually declared the system broken. These were the Minister of Health and the Minister of International Trade and Development Cooperation, both women. They said the system is broken. Patent and intellectual property exclusivities are the only cornerstone of the current model. Companies can ask the price they like. This will no longer do. We need to develop alternative business models. And I strongly believe that that is the way we need to go. What we have learned from HIV is that we can move mountains. This is another mountain that needs to be moved, but it will require very strong international collaboration and solidarity to do that. But if we're serious about treating the world for all the diseases that require treatments, some drastic measures need to be taken. And on these websites you can find some more information. The second one, accestomedicines.org, is a website that's held by Health Action International that gives you a crash course, intellectual property and access to medicines, should you be interested in learning more about it. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Let me turn to Charles. Charles, you've been 4 weeks into your new role with the Medicines Patent Pool, and you've been a long-term activist on hepatitis, on a number of other health issues. Where do you see opportunities? What do you see challenges as we move forward?
Thank you very much indeed, Pradeep, and thank you to UNAIDS for inviting me. And interestingly, I moved out of the hepatitis C world to take up this new job precisely because I believe in this concept of treating the world and providing access. And I think that, a lot of things have come up this afternoon, around some of the key things. But I'd like to, I think, concentrate on three things. The first is around timeliness of access. And Anil, you talked about that, trying to shorten the time from when drugs are first licensed in the developed world until they're available in the developing world. And I think that, as a matter of fact, dolutegravir is a really good example of that from HIV, and is therefore a lesson that we should take into other areas about how a drug can arrive not just in its original form but in combination with other drugs through licensing to, in this case, us, the Medicines Patent Pool, and then licensing to generic manufacturers like Mylan, who have brought TLD to market within this really short time. And that is something that we need to pay particular attention to, because these mechanisms are great, but not if it takes another 10 years for them to reach market in the areas that they're needed. And the second point that I think that is interesting around how HIV can inform the move into other areas is around new technologies. And this is something that's not easy and we're going to have to grapple with. And Helen, you were talking about long-acting injectables, for example. And that is one of the new technologies we are going to have to get to grips with in HIV, and then in other areas. But it isn't just long-acting injectables. There are a lot of others, whether it's implants, nanoformulations of existing medicines, monoclonal antibodies, and this is going to be a challenge. But again, I think HIV is a very nice paradigm for what we can do elsewhere. And the third point that I want to make really is about the medicines patent pool model. And I do think that this is a really good model. It's not the only model, it's not the solution to the problem, but it is potentially part of the solution. And so it's one of the reasons I think that in 2016 WHO and the Lancet Commission on Essential Medicines that was mentioned earlier suggested that the medicines patent pool should expand out of HIV, where we started, very much thanks to Ellen, as it happens, and then expanded into hepatitis C and TB, and now into essential medicines. And so that is something that our board have decided they would like us to do. And it's not just patented essential medicines, it's things that, for example, did not make it onto the WHO essential medicines list because they were considered too expensive in comparison to existing medicines. Or things, and again we're talking about trying to speed up the process, that might get onto the essential medicines list, because the essential medicines list at the moment is currently only updated every 2 years. So it's the requirement to look ahead, and actually for us to look further upstream, not wait until something is already out there on the market, but actually to be talking to originators much earlier on, so that we can try and shorten that gap. And so over the past year we did a feasibility study to look at whether we could do this, and we've identified some possible areas, and parts of cancer, as you mentioned, might be one of them. But clearly it's something that'll take us a little bit of time to really work out where it makes the most sense, where we can have the most public health benefit, because that's really what we are. We're a public health organization that is trying to address the public health needs. But some caution around that. As I said, we are not the answer. And as Anil pointed out right at the beginning about the conditions that you need really to make this model work, and we're going to have to think about how we can make sure that those conditions exist, as they do in HIV, in many of the other areas. And obviously a particular one is demand. Because you can have a very nice license, you can have generic manufacturers ready to step up and produce, but if there's no demand, particularly from governments, that's an issue. And you know, one of the things that I think we do need to think about is putting more pressure on governments to expand their budgets. We can do the bit about helping to bring the prices right down, but if the governments don't step up and invest in healthcare, it's still not necessarily going to get to the people who need it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we certainly need to start putting more pressure on governments, but also really the bottom up from the community. How can we really put the pressure to generate demand? I'm going to turn to Sharon and Lynch. Sharon, and what is it going to take us to get to treating the world?
So we need a couple of things, and that includes the participation of civil society to continue to put pressure. Companies have to do 5 things. Governments have to do 5 things. So where would you like for me to start? What companies have to do is provide non-exclusive voluntary licenses to the medicines patent pool. They need to register their products within 2 months of approval by a stringent drug regulatory, EMA or FDA. They need to open their books, and I know we'll never win this. We've been saying this for 18 years. In terms of R&D investment for a product, the prices that are being offered across countries, because we know they're different, registration status and where they've submitted dossiers, because that information my colleague to my left has not exactly always shared, licensing information and patent status. They also need to stop seeking evergreening and creative patents, whether it be on fixed dose combination, color of pills, etc. And as well, share, this especially matters in the world of TB, frankly, share data, clinical trial data, as well as molecules, so that we could facilitate the development of regimens. Right now, MSF, which is a medical humanitarian organization, we're running clinical trials to see about the effect of 2 new DRTB drugs. For the first time that we've had new DRTB drugs, drug-resistant TB drugs, in 40 years, because of the nature of the competitive silo system. Companies did not share in the pipeline, so there was no way to know whether the drugs improved care when they were combined. It appears based on early indication that they do. So those are the 5 things that that companies need to do. Now, I'd like to talk about the procurement cliff. So Andrew Hill talked about the patent cliff. I'm going to talk about the global fund procurement cliff. So it has been 18 years of having ARVs in the public sector. It has been 16 years where the global fund and countries have helped to develop healthier markets than what we started with when the ARVs were $10,000 in 2000. So that means multiple suppliers so that we could have competition, so we can have a healthy supply, and we didn't have to worry about global instability in the market. They also insisted upon WHO prequalification or stringent drug regulatory. That set the standard where it should be in terms of quality. They also helped with supply in terms of forecasting on the demand side. And of course, registration. You heard from Anil mention the waiver. Because right now we're in a moment where it's based on the kindness of companies to register their products. But what if they don't care? In Armenia, MSF has had to fill the shortage of first-line TB drugs because drugs weren't registered in the country and no one responded to the tender that the government issued. Those are first-line TB drugs. Philippines, a failed tender. No one responded to a tender for pediatric first-line TB drugs. In India, right now, there is a shortage of pediatric ARVs. Why? Because a switch to national procurement from the Global Fund resulted in a low price from a local manufacturer that was not approved by WHO prequalification, that was not registered by SDRA, but also was not able to meet demand, resulting in a shortage. There are more examples. These 3 examples I'm giving you have been in the last 2 months. This is a very new phenomenon. So what governments need to do, and before we lose this, what some might consider a legacy of the Global Fund in these big markets, but it was truly a lifeline for people with HIV and TB and Hep C, must be retained. What governments need to do is insist upon WHO prequalification or SDRA as they transition from the Global Fund. And mind you, because donors have not been supporting the Global Fund, many countries that are still eligible for Global Fund funding are pressured to co-finance. So it's ridiculous to split already sensitive markets, fragile markets, pediatric TB drugs, pediatric ARVs. So Georgia, for example, has promised to procure 50% of their ARVs and their second-line TB drugs by the end of the year. What Georgia did, though, was a waiver insisted upon WHO prequalification and still access to the global market, both the global drug facility and the voluntary pooled procurement mechanism. Most countries that are transitioning from the Global Fund or co-financing, they do not have this luxury. So there needs to be a change so that they can, rather than just doing competitive bidding process that is limited mostly to local manufacturers, mind you, especially where there are small markets, to be able to still access that global market. That requires a policy change. Governments also have to be transparent about the price that they get. You know we won't have this as a luxury in some countries. We work in 8 countries providing treatment for drug-resistant TB in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Do you think that there's a history of transparency when it comes to procurement? Do you consider that there could be a perverse incentive in terms of higher prices, higher kickbacks? You heard the example from Andrew in terms of Bulgaria. I will tell you as well. In Belarus, they're paying 38 times more for dolutegravir than the generic worldwide index price. Countries also need to enroll in the WHO collaborative registration procedure. Again, we cannot wait for companies to register all their products. We have been in discussion with ViiV for their pediatric drugs, 2 formulations, a 10 milligram and a 25 milligram. While the adult drug was approved by EMA in 2014, the pediatric formulations were approved in 2017. We have been discussing with ViiV for a couple of years. We need access. We need affordable access. They promised access. They promised that they were going to make the drug available near at cost. Now, we met with ViiV yesterday. They agreed that they would make the drug available to MSF patients where we work in Malawi. That's very nice, and I'm happy for those children. However, ViiV refuses to sell the drug where it's not registered, but they're also not registering the drug. So, even though the drug was approved in 2017, guess how many countries in sub-Saharan Africa the drug is registered? This is pediatric dolutegravir. 3 countries, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. We and the rest, and many NGOs in the room and others sent a letter to ViiV. We wanted an answer whether there will be reform to this policy, but we also want urgency. I was thinking about Katrina in 2005, where every day you wake up and you turn on the TV after this Hurricane Katrina drowned most of New Orleans. And every day still, there were people on the roof waiting to be picked up. It's almost like what is happening with children in the U.S. and Trump. Every day you turn on the TV and there are still kids and babies in cages. When is ViiV going to have a light that is lit under them in terms of registering this product? Now remember, they gave a voluntary license for pediatric dolutegravir to the Medicines Patent Pool. That was a nice press release. Medicines Patent Pool puts out a press release. Thank you for this voluntary license. We're very happy for it. But there wasn't a generic company that picked it up. Otsuka as well has a DRTB drug for kids. It's, delaminid. Nobody has picked that up. You cannot paper over and get publicity for giving a drug to the Medicines Patent Pool unless you agree to supply it until a generic comes on board and until there's adequate supply. Otherwise, it's just a PR exercise. Thank you. So here is the concern. When we get the next presentation from Andrew Hill on the next regimens across the science, HIV, Hep C, TB, and DRTB, we might be talking about some new exciting medicines, and eventually there will be a generic competitor that will bring down the price and hopefully a voluntary license. But here's the problem. We're going to be talking about a bifurcated world where the Global Fund eligibility is also used to define who gets a voluntary license deal, who gets access prices. And that means we're going to be talking about low prices like the $60 for dolutegravir. But if we are still talking about the $2,200 for the same drug in Belarus, then it's ridiculous. We have to wake up. The Global Fund has got to wake up. WHO has got to take action on this to make sure that we don't lose all of the benefits of the last 16 years of building these markets. Otherwise, we will not have pills in the bodies and science will be stopped at the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and I guess some of these difficult conversations need to happen, and I'm glad that you started that. Let's open up for a few questions. If you have a question or a really brief comment, could you please come to the microphones which are here. Introduce yourself, just your name and your affiliation, and keep your comments or questions really short. If it is a question, please indicate who the question is addressed to.
Yeah. I'm really happy to see a lot of people that I know in the room. Pretty nice session. Ellen, thank you so much for helping with the Medicare patent pool. It really did save a lot of people, particularly in the Global South. And my question goes to Charles. I think it's really great that you're working around expansion. In December, I was in Abidjan for the ICASA conference. I'm asking a very specific question because this also goes towards ViiV's issue around access to DTG for pediatrics. You and I know that access to treatment is less than 40% in that region. As much as the global landscape is balancing out in a lot of places where people are getting treatment, in the region it's still a big issue. And, most of issues around HIV is still funded by multilaterals and governments outside. How are you working towards prioritizing the region in terms of keeping the medical patent pool a patient-focused institution and not one that is really colliding with big pharma in terms of advancing their interests? It's nice PR, nice release. I read your report around the catch-up plan that you have for Africa. Beautiful. But we really, really want something tangible. If you go to the grassroots, access to essential medicine in the area of HIV is really, really a big issue for the general population, and it's even bleak for children. And I hope I am on DTG, and there's not a lot of data for young people who've been growing up with HIV and what it means. And the community is a little giddy about what this really means. With recent publications and findings for women, I hope there will be a lot of interventions in making sure that many of us who get world-class healthcare are also not falling through the cracks. And for heaven's sake, make DTG accessible to children. It's 2018.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Thank you very much indeed for that. The first thing I should say is that, as Pradeep said, I'm very new to this. But the very first thing I'm doing is reaching out to the community. So we have an event tomorrow with GNP Plus in the Global Village, and I hope that you will come by, because that's what I want to do first, is listen to what the concerns are, to make sure that we do what we can to address those concerns. But as I said during my talk, we're not the only answer to this. And there are a lot of other people. We can do a certain amount in terms of getting the licenses, getting the sub-licensees, giving them the licenses to manufacture. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of other people to ensure that you and children in particular get what they need.
And thanks for your comment, and also to reflect, Sharon Ann, of course we listen and understand the concerns that MSF has with regards to access, and ViiV remains committed to supporting access. I think the challenge with paediatrics often is that the process for developing paediatric drugs and the research that supports their dosing and safety and efficacy is often oversimplified, and that causes some challenges and makes some of the timing not as optimal as we would like. We would readily admit that the time it's taken for determining and registering the pediatric doses is not what we ever intended with our partners in the clinical studies, but children are not mini adults, as we all know, and therefore it has taken time and rework to make sure that we get suitable and appropriate doses that are safe and effective for children. We continue to be committed to support beyond registrational studies. And to the gentleman who just spoke, the Odyssey study we're doing is exactly a very big study being conducted by Penta to really answer the question, to support the optimal treatment use of dolutegravir in first and second line in children. And we expect that will be very helpful and informative for the use of the drug in young people. We're not waiting for that, but it is an important piece in helping support registrations. We are committed to exploring CRP. The challenge with CRP is that it's not, a lot of these things aren't up to a pharmaceutical company on their own to determine whether we use these avenues or not. The WHO has an opinion, ministries of health have an opinion, and of course they rely on WHO guidelines, of which the 10 and 25 milligrams are not specified. So we continue to work with that, and we will continue to challenge that, and we will continue to pursue registrations of products to make them available.
Did you say Monday's release of the WHO guidelines?
It doesn't include the 10 and 25 milligrams.
So the question is, in terms of, yes, science is complicated, yes, children are not small adults, but also the question is, do you have to generate new data for Mozambique, for Malawi, that you didn't already have for the larger markets where you filed, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya? So is it a data issue for you? Why the drug, you haven't submitted a dossier for registration in Malawi? Are you waiting on new data to submit for Malawi?
No,
Let's
So then-
come back to that.
Right.
No, that's an important question. Let's come back to that. But I have two others on the floor. Let's take the two questions. First, we start with the gentleman at 6, and then we go to, I can't see the number on this microphone, but the lady here. But let's start there.
Sure.
first.
Hello, my name is Michael, and I had a question for the last speaker specifically. You said 5 things for companies and 5 things for governments, and it got me all riled up, and you talked about New Orleans, and I wanted to know if you could give me 5 things that someone like in the community could do to help all of that happen, because I feel powerless.
Don't.
Let's
sorry,
take the other question. Thank you very much, sir. Number 2 there.
Hi, I am asking Ellen and Andrew, why are countries not importing generic Truvada in Europe? Don't they have the right? I'm also with Break the Patent. We are announcing a national action plan for universal access to HIV PrEP in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Let's first take the first question, Sharon, and if you could respond to 5 things that the community should do. And
So I am so embarrassed because I said 5 things for governments, but then I didn't get to the 5th one. The 5th one is to utilize TRIPS flexibilities and safeguards, including pre and post granting of patents. So what the community can do is to push for that transparency among governments in terms of procurement. What are your procurement policies? Push for the transparency from drug companies. We have asked, the person to my right and the person to my left in the last 24 hours to be transparent about the registration plans for a drug that Mylan has and a drug for ViiV has. So that transparency is critical across the board. But also, we obviously need to have governments have the right policies in place, meaning you have to push for quality. It is governments, of course, are going to land back on trying to fund their local production. There is nothing wrong with local production, but we also need affordability and we also need quality.
you're still leaving the wonderful community person helpless in the whole equation.
No, I'm not at all. I mean, part of it is there are only a few people that are looking into this issue. So to be a part of the lobbying of Global Fund, WHO, UNITAID, PEPFAR, and the UK. Why the UK? Because they have been among the ones pressuring Global Fund to turn off the tap and to give less to countries that are lucky enough not to be poor enough in order to qualify for more funding. The US, one, because they've also pressured the Global Fund to do the same. And you know as well as I do that PEPFAR will be expected to pick up some of the gaps that are going to be left with all of these shortages like MSF has. I've given you 2 examples of shortages in the last 2 months where MSF is filling the gap. PEPFAR will be pressured as well. Third, WHO has got to be part of the solution in terms of insisting upon and promoting both the WHO pre-qualification and the WHO collaborative registration procedure. But it doesn't help when UNITAID, when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when other funders are starting to reduce their funding for those 2 projects. This is not the time to be turning away from WHO pre-qualification whatsoever.
Thank you.
Yeah? Okay. Well, she's happy.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm not sure if the gentleman is, but Andrew, do you want to? I'm just teasing you.
Yeah, I know.
Andrew and Ellen, do you want to say first?
Okay. We're both going to answer the question on Truvada. I hope we'll have the same answer. But we had a very good session yesterday in the Global Village on the use of supplementary protection certificates in Europe, which is a mechanism that exists. It's a European Union regulation that allows companies to ask for patent extensions, basically for up to 5 years, if they haven't enjoyed at least 15 years of market exclusivity for a particular product. And Gilead has managed in a number of European countries to obtain an SPC for Truvada, even though if you look at the technical details, it should not have been granted. So the answer to your question is those countries where there is still a patent or an exclusivity related to Truvada, it is because the patent offices erroneously extended the patent by granting an SPC. That should not have happened. The UK case is at the moment before the European Court, and a decision by the European Court is expected any time. Countries that have rejected the SPC, such as the Netherlands, generic Truvada is actually available and the price has come down significantly, although there is still room for improvement to bring the price down further. The whole issue of these exclusivities and the evergreening of patents is one that needs to be tackled tackled. Europe is incredibly generous in compensating companies with a large variety of exclusive rights. It is at the moment being examined at the European level whether this is indeed the wisest way to spend our money. So this is another area where mobilization is needed, and I'm happy to share all the technical details on the matter with any of you. Thank you.
Andrew.
Yeah. Just to add to that, in a lot of European countries it's legal for individuals to break patents, individuals to import drugs for their personal use through buyers clubs, to buy them online. And it's happens with thousands of people in the UK importing drugs to prevent HIV, to cure hepatitis C, to treat cancer. It's happening more and more. But people have just got to realise that provided they import drugs through a reliable source, these are as good as the ones from the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay. Thank you. Anil.
Just to add, because PrEP is so critical and because there's such a change in Europe, just to add to what was just shared by Ellen and Andrew, Truvada is going generic across Europe this year. And so Mylan is one of a number of companies that's already selling generic Truvada in a dozen countries already in Europe. And the SPC that Ellen mentioned, the decision on, I mean, just so you can look at the news, tomorrow, we're at the AIDS conference. Tomorrow, the European Court is going to be making a decision on the SPC. So keep your eyes out.
Thank you. Last two questions. We start with microphone number 2 and then number 5. If anyone has a burning question, the last one, we can take 3 and then we are going to close.
Thanks very much. My name is Diarmuid. I work with Stop AIDS and Just Treatment in the UK. I've got 2 questions. The first one is exceedingly brief. It's to the representative from ViiV. We've got such a challenge with registration on dolutegravir. A very simple thing that you can do is agree to publish within 1 month a timetable for the registration of pediatric dolutegravir across sub-Saharan Africa. Can you commit to doing that today? The second question. I work in the UK around access to medicines. It's a Western country where we now have patients dying without access to treatment because it's too expensive. I know and worked with cancer patients that have been denied breast cancer treatment, and we also know hepatitis patients that died whilst they were waiting for a drug that was being rationed due to the high price. This is the same across cystic fibrosis and lots of other conditions. I'm just going to ask the question, at what point, because we've seen so many lives lost in the developing world because of high prices that are seemingly cheap enough to be lost, at what point we're going to see a tipping point and realize that those high prices of drugs are costing lives in the West, that's going to push for a total political change, that's going to force the reform of the system. And that goes right from the high prices through to the entire system of how we develop and incentivize the creation of new medicines.
Thank you very much. The lady at number 5, please.
Thank you. My name is Marijn de Jong from AIDS Fonds. In this whole story, it was very inspiring, and I was also wondering if you have some thoughts about how clinicians and researchers can also play a role in having an influence on pricing, because what I see in the system now is that research is very much needed, and having collaborations with pharmaceutical companies, clinical trials are being done, a lot of clinicians are involved, and at the end, clinicians are again paying the high prices for those medications they maybe even participated in the trials. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Is that addressed to anyone in particular or across?
I like the 5 points system.
Okay. The last question.
Sorry, it's actually not a question, just a quick update on the state of generic development of pediatric dolutegravir. As I think further to the point that Helen has made, that I think it's indeed that we need robust clinical data to support the proper dosing in children. So that's one thing. And actually, the generic companies who have taken dolutegravir licenses from the MPP have been developing pediatric formulations. I think there are at least 4 of them have been working on a dispersible tablet. I think now we're getting close to having the dolutegravir label expansion to the younger children, and also I think it's good to acknowledge our partners Unitate and CHAI has recently issued an incentive program for 2 of our licensees, I believe Mylan and McLeod's, to further accelerate the development of the 10 milligram dispersible dolutegravir tablets, and then they're also exploring quite interesting regulatory pathway so that they can hopefully file, I believe, just shortly after ViiV is going for label label expansion. And so I just want to add this point. And also, I think generic development in general takes about 2 to 3 years. So I think I think it's just useful to take it into account when you're counting the delays.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a 30-second closing word from each one, except the ones who have been asked a question. You get 30 seconds extra. Yay. Yeah. Okay. So, Anil, maybe I'll start with you, and then we can go down this way.
Yeah, sure. So 30 seconds. So 3 points. First, I agree with Ellen. She said there's a 6th element missing from my 5 elements, and she was right. And we absolutely have to protect TRIPS flexibilities, and we should make sure that that's explicitly clear in the high-level meeting at the United Nations on tuberculosis. That's point number 1. Point number 2, Sharon Ann helped flag for me, for you, and I just want to repeat this. Middle-income countries are in crisis. And the global fund transition is an area that we should all be concerned about as we fight a global epidemic. And point number 3, the question was asked, what can physicians do? For those of you who have any engagement in the United States, what I would say is providers and patients, people, they're actually part of the problem. And I say this provocatively because the U.S. system is one in which there's no transparency on prices. And the median copay for an HIV-positive patient is $10 a month or less. And that is furthering an industry in which you have $40,000 list prices like Andrew mentioned earlier. So to providers and to patients, look at what you're taking and actually ask the question, are there low-cost alternatives that can help shift the marketplace in the United States? That was more than 30 seconds. I apologize for the...
Well, that was a minute, but Sharon, and you really get 60 seconds.
I really do. So for 30-second answer to the question about what researchers can do, remember who made the polio vaccine. He said, I'm not going to patent it. I wouldn't patent the sky. Secondly, Yale helped to develop D4T. Thank you for D4T. Glad you're away. Once they realized that with the licensing deal that they had with BMS, they insisted upon fair pricing. Third, the co-developer of tenofovir was from a country that wasn't even able to access, one, because it wasn't registered, tenofovir. So researchers can have sway. Partly it's in the tech transfer agreement that you do. So if you are developing a drug, if you are a researcher, and you're going to license it to a drug company to develop and to bring forward, insist upon fair pricing, insist upon fair licensing, and insist upon wide distribution. Secondly, to be transparent about the cost and what went into that development. Likely, if you're an academic, you got money from government to be able to do your work. Anything that is public sector funded should be considered a public good. The fact that some people are paying for this twice is absolutely ridiculous in terms of taxes. So delinkage is something that academics and the rest of us should absolutely push for. So that was 30 seconds, right? Now, my other 30 seconds. We have to change radically the way that medicines and medical commodities are conceived of, developed, and delivered. And so if we want to talk about profit margins, let's do that. Let's make companies agree early on in the process, even before we know the cost of APIs, that when it's early market entry, they will agree to an X percentage of a profit margin. When they have more of the market, that they will reduce and have a ceiling in terms of that profit margin. We'll talk in your language, whatever. But for companies that receive government-funded, so a DRTB drug, bedaquiline, that was developed in part with government funding, where U.S. and high-income countries are being charged $30,000 for a 6-month dose treatment regimen, where middle-income countries outside of the global drug facility are being charged $3,000 for 6 months of drug on top of thousands of dollars that cost for a DRTB regimen anyway. It is not right. The funding came from the public sector. We need to not allow for governments to abdicate their responsibility for funding research and development for infectious disease. And this then means that any medicine that is developed with public sector funding is a public good. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Even as an Indian, for me, time is stretchable, but that was more than 30 seconds. But,
that was 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the question. So yesterday we made the commitment to MSF that we will publish on our website the registration status in terms of submissions and approvals of dolutegravir containing products. In terms of my summary, I think I'll pick on the same point that Anil has mentioned. Clearly here, and elsewhere around this conference, there's a huge focus on the issues and challenges facing middle-income countries. And ViiV takes this commitment very seriously, and we will be exploring whether there's new models that can be used than we currently have to better and more improve the access in those countries.
Thank you, Charles.
I'm taking the prerogative of being somebody who's really new to say something pretty anodyne just at the end, but I do think this conference has been both looking at the glass half full and looking at the glass half empty. And, you know, it's been very much here we are on this road, and I think the road to a much more universal access has really started in HIV. And there's been huge progress, and there's still this vast amount to do, and it's going to be a massive challenge. But the point is that we've got this far is, for me, really a cause for optimism.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I wanted to respond to the question about the role of the clinicians. I think it's going to be incredibly important that the clinicians, and not only those involved in HIV treatment, but also the oncologists and those involved in TB and what have you, sort of join the revolt and say enough is enough. This high drug price crisis needs to be addressed. We don't accept it any longer, and not function as apologists for the pricing practices by large pharmaceutical companies, which today happens all too often. And second, I support what Sharon Ann said, as those of you that are involved in research, from day one, ask yourself, when you engage in drug development activities, what is your responsibility and what are your options in terms of making agreements with corporations you work with regard to pricing and access at the end of the day. And too often I hear people say, oh, we can't do that because then we will lose our funding or we'll lose this and that and the other. But that's where change needs to come. These agreements need to change, and that will require a bit of a culture shift within medical academic world.
Thank you.
Okay. 2 points to finish. The first one is there are lots of press releases about voluntary licensing and many countries being able to access drugs like dolutegravir or TLD for very low prices. It's not that simple. There are many middle-income countries paying much higher prices. You know, whereas TLD might cost $75 in the poorest countries, it'll cost thousands of dollars in upper middle-income countries. And finally, for the doctor who said, what can I do as a clinician? Doctors should never be in the position of facing a patient and saying, I can't treat you because the drug's too expensive. We've been through this already with PrEP, with cancer, with hepatitis, and there are a growing number of brave doctors who are bringing the drugs in from abroad. These buyers clubs are just growing by the year. I never believed this would be happening 5 years ago, but it is a way for individuals to take the power into their own hands. It needs a lot of expert advice on supply channels, but this is actually becoming quite a mainstream way of preventing HIV in the UK, and I think it's going to grow to other diseases. We're already seeing it more and more in other things like cancer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's been a fascinating conversation. I'm not going to try and conclude. I'm just going to say just three. I know everybody seems to be getting on to 5, but I'll stay with 3. I really believe that these kind of difficult conversations are really important. We need to start challenging each other much more, not just in conferences, but on a day-to-day basis. I know we do that, but we need to do more of that. Number 2, trust. If you're not really able to trust each other and really start building on each other's trust and the history that we have, we will not make it forward. And the last one is really transparency. There's a lot more that we need to put out there in the public domain. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of you.